Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We hope you're staying safe and well. Today, author and instructor Steve King will help you navigate some of the issues facing you and your teams as we adjust to working from home while trying to remain focused and productive. In today's webinar, you'll learn how to establish goals, development opportunities, and rewards for your team, understand the 3 conditions needed for team success, gain insights into how culture impacts team performance and business plans, and explore the human synergistics group style inventory as a tool for measuring team culture. Before I introduce Steve, I want to share a brief introduction of the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, or CPED. CPED partners with individuals and organizations to enhance performance and productivity through professional development programs, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. Professional development programs are delivered on-site in beautiful downtown Madison, and we now offer online programs as well, all facilitated by instructors with practical, real-world experience. The Center for Professional and Executive Development also partners with organizations throughout the country to provide customized on-site and online professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. If you have questions you'd like to ask during today's webinar, you can submit those questions using the questions box from the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse the sidebar using the orange arrow, as you can see on your screen. We'll pose questions that are submitted during a Q&A at the end of today's webinar, and throughout the session today, Steve will have some questions for you, and you can again respond to those questions using the questions box. It'll function as sort of a chat box for our purposes here today. I also do want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be sent out after the webinar later this week or early next week. And now I'd like to introduce Steve King. Steve is a retired executive director of the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development and the president of SDK Group, which specializes in helping organizations find solutions for their business-related talent management challenges. Steve teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Northwestern University, and Morehouse College in Atlanta. Steve spent more than 25 years leading in corporate settings. He was a senior vice president of human resources for Hewitt Associates, a global HR and outsourcing firm. He also served as a vice president of global talent management for Baxter Healthcare, faculty leader for the Bank of Montreal's Institute for Learning in Toronto, and vice president of management and professional development for Harris Bank in Chicago. Steve lives here in Madison, Wisconsin, and is the author of 4 books on management: Brag, Worry, Wonder, Bet, 6 Conversations, Alignment Process Relationships, and Prevention and Contingencies. And Steve, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, John, and thanks everybody for joining in. And as John suggested, as we move along through the course of the webinar, which will maybe be 30-ish minutes long, if you have questions or comments, just drop them in the box, and John will inform me that they are there, and we'll have a conversation, and then we'll leave some time at the end to talk about it as well. So CPED has asked me to talk a little bit about the distinction between managing individuals and managing teams, with maybe a little of an emphasis on the managing teams part and what's different about managing individuals versus what's different about managing teams. So I'm going to attempt to organize my thoughts around that, share them with you, and then get some of your thoughts on it as well. So John, if you move to the next slide. So whenever I am talking to groups of people or individuals about teams, what I often find is that one of the easiest ways to talk about teams is just to kind of talk briefly about teams that we admire, because when we unpack the teams that we admire, I think we begin to see some of the criteria that makes teams good teams. And so you see, if you're actually visually seeing now a picture of 4 musicians, I'll just start by offering you an example of a team that I admire, and then pivot to how we can talk about in terms of managing individuals and managing teams. So what you're looking at there are 4 of 6 players in a jazz sextet. Those are actually individual jazz musicians on this picture who are relatively famous in and of their own right, if you know jazz. So I'll just name them going from left to right. That's John Coltrane, that's Cannonball Adderley, that's Miles Davis, and that's Bill Evans. Now, this is a session back in the 1960s that was put together by Miles Davis. They were making an album called Kind of Blue. Why do I admire this team of musicians, which actually were under the direction of the Miles Davis guy? Well, they did a number of things I love. First of all, they blended together some remarkable expertise. They were all individually great jazz people in and of themselves, but here they were working together. They were quite innovative in what they were producing for that particular album, and in fact, that album is the best-selling jazz album ever. So I guess their results were actually pretty good. But what I particularly was impressed with, and I read a biography about Miles Davis, was that he talked about how he simultaneously had to manage the individual talent in this group while simultaneously managing the group as a team, and how he had to manage between both sides of that equation. This is what attracts me to the topic that we're covering today, is how does a manager do that? Because there are some things that are very similar when you talk about managing individuals and managing teams, and there are some things that are quite different when you think about managing teams. So John, if you move to the next slide, let me just comment first about what I would call the similarities. In other words, managing a team is a lot like managing an individual. So in one of my books, Six Conversations, I talk about 6 conversations that most employees want to have regularly with their managers. And those 6 conversations are basically these questions here. What's expected of me? What and how should I develop? How am I doing? How did I do? How will I be rewarded? And what's next for me? Now, there are other questions that employees want answered as well, but this is sort of, I'll call it a common denominator set of questions that employees generally want to have answered. And good managers know how to have conversations about these particular 6 questions. That is just good management of individuals. But these 6 questions, or actually 5 of them, actually give us a clue about how you manage teams in a very similar way. So John, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So taking the last question out, which I'll comment about in a moment, basically, when you think about managing teams, it is a little bit like managing individuals, because the same questions are in play. All you do is change one of the words. And so instead of what's expected of me, I think the question the team wants to ask is what's expected of us. And then questions like what and how should I develop becomes what and how should we develop, or how are we doing, or how did we do, or how will we be rewarded. So I just want to comment about these because I think these are simply extensions of managing individuals to teams and answering the same kind of question. So let's just kind of run down that list. What's expected of us really has to do with the issue of team goals. Now, in a moment, in the next slide, but not yet, I want to talk a little bit about team goal setting. But most teams actually have team goals, and therefore you need to create clarity as a manager for what that team looks like, much like you create clarity for an individual. What and how should we develop actually speaks to the fact that on some teams there are some common skill sets, common knowledge sets, and common behaviors that the entire team needs to have in their sort of quiver in order to use on a regular basis. And so there is an issue around the team development, not necessarily just the individual development. So what is that for your team? What are those common skill sets? What are those common knowledge sets? Number 3, how are we doing? Which is really a feedback question, right? As we're doing the work we do individually, how am I doing? You want to get feedback on how you're doing. The team's the same way. And so there needs to be a feedback mechanism that allows the team to hear as a team how they're doing as a team. Next one, how did we do? Which is sort of a after action review moment in the form of how did I do? That's usually your performance review. But you can put together a performance review for a team in a certain period of time. I'll comment about that one. One of my books is called Brag, Worry, Wonder, Bet, which is a book about how to give feedback. And it's not uncommon for me that when I led teams to have team meetings, maybe quarterly, in which we would do the following. We would, as a group, say, what are we bragging about when we brag about the team? What are we worried about when we worry about the team? What do we wonder about? And what do we bet on? And just that exercise was a kind of feedback mechanism to tell the team as a team how they were doing. And then finally, how will we be rewarded? Now, this can be about extrinsic rewards like money or intrinsic rewards, but let me stay on the money side here and just suggest the following. Whenever I hear someone says, we are all about the team, usually the next question I ask is, so do you reward the team as a team? Do you have team reward systems? And often I get a blank stare like, well, no, I reward individuals. I said, well, then I don't know whether you've incented the team to be a team. And so if you are really operating largely as a team, I think the question legitimately is how will we as a group be rewarded as a group? So I'm using these five questions. I'll comment about the sixth in a moment. I'm using these five questions just to highlight the fact that if a manager is having individual conversations reasonably well, they can simply pivot and use the same five, in this case, five questions, and talk about those same issues with their team as a whole. It's like managing an individual, only it's managing the team. I'm not sure what's next for me, which is really a kind of a career conversation, is this relevant for a team? Because at least in most cases, and I mean most, like nearly all, teams don't move through a career together. Usually teams are together for a while and then they kind of go their separate ways. So I'm not quite sure it's relevant. I probably could find a few examples, but for most of the time, for most of us, probably not quite as relevant. Now, in that first question, what's expected of us? I think the answer to that question, and a little bit to the rest of them, pivots around an important issue of team structure. So John, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So what I've done here is just to kind of give you some sort of spectrum, right? And at one end of the spectrum, we have independent team structures, and the other one, we have integrated team structures. So let me explain what I mean by these two things. Some teams that I've observed are basically teams in almost only name only. And what I mean by that is I may have a team of 5 people. Every one of them is an individual project manager. Each one of them is doing their own projects. And while they may talk to each other about their individual projects, and they might confer with each other about some ideas, by and large, each member of the team is kind of doing their own thing. Well, in that context, the notion of a team goal might be nothing more than the summation of the 5 different projects. So it's a little trickier to create a team goal the further to the left independent structures you get. On the other hand, the integrated team structures, which by that I mean when the team does work in which it's highly integrated, person A really can't do their job well unless person B does their job well, and person C can't do their job well unless both A and B do theirs as well. So what you've got is a highly integrated system. And in that case, it's probably much easier to talk about a team goal because everybody's interdependent and often the work is kind of a choreographed or highly synchronized kind of work system. So when we answer the question, what's expected of us, I think moving to the right, the more integrated the structure of the team, the easier that becomes. Moving to the left, more independent the structure, the harder it becomes. Now, it doesn't mean it's impossible. Yeah, I do believe that there are plenty of organizations that have relatively independent team structures but have a common vision, a common purpose. And they really do reward people for working across that structure for nothing other than to help develop each other, motivate each other, give each other feedback. And you could set those as business goals or behavioral goals for the team. So it's still possible, but it's not quite the same thing as an integrated team. John, would you mind moving to the next slide? So what I thought I would do is then highlight for you what may be quite different when you manage a team versus individuals. So, 6 conversations or 5 conversations refitted for a team, that's basically managing a team like you manage individuals. But here are 4 of many, and there are others, but here are 4 elements to managing a team that are different really than managing individuals on your team. So I want to talk about each of these individually, but let me introduce you to all of them. Number 1, managing collaboration. Well, you collaborate with other people, so therefore it's automatically a team dynamic. So the question is, how does a manager effectively create a collaborative team environment? Number 2 would be managing the work and the talent fit. And what I mean by that is you are faced with a choice point around, do I fit the talent into the work or to fit the work around the talent, which we'll talk about. Third, managing team culture, which John mentioned in the introduction. So I often describe team culture as culture's like a lake, and then the boats on the lake are how you align your team and how you create process for your team and how you manage relationships on your team. And these three boats of alignment, process, and relationships sit on top of a lake, and the lake is the culture. So here's the metaphor extended. When the lake is calm, it's sure much easier to align your team. When the lake is calm, it's sure a lot easier to manage relationships and manage process. When the lake is choppy and rough, it's harder to maneuver those other boats around. So there's this issue of, as a manager, how do I manage the culture of the team so I can do the work more effectively and make it work? So we'll talk about that. And then finally, managing team dynamics, which, by the way, in a period like COVID, in a pandemic, has really changed. And I think we want to talk briefly about that as well. So these are the four what I would call more uniquely team-oriented management challenges. Let's take a look at each one of them individually. So John, if you wouldn't mind sliding to the next slide, let's talk about managing collaboration. Now, this is a topic that's huge, and there is a lot of great literature out there, and there's a lot of great points of view. I don't think there's a singular, oh, this is exactly the way to do it. But I do want to offer you at least one perspective on managing collaboration on your team, because I want to start off with a bias I have, and I'll sort of share it. A lot of research suggests it's true, and that is, if you can effectively manage collaboration in your team solutions to problems are generally better than individual solutions to the problems if you know how to manage the collaboration. Now, if you don't, then I'm not so certain it's anything other than a free-for-all. But if you do, then I think you can actually create better solutions, solve problems more effectively, and plan and execute better if you know how to manage the collaboration. So let me suggest, as a simple example, three things that help you manage collaboration well. Number one, I'm going to call it leveraging knowledge. On your team, there are people with different levels of knowledge in different topics and different expertise. And some managers are really quite good at leveraging that knowledge, and some maybe are not. The good ones know how to recognize that person A has this knowledge, person B has that knowledge, person C has another set of knowledge, and how to bring all that to the table. Let everybody share their data essentially and sort through it and begin to leverage all that knowledge. That is an excellent team management exercise for collaboration. Number two, leveraging diversity. And by diversity here, I mean diversity of experience. So that could mean, for example, diversity in the most traditional sense of the word, which is seeing a variety of different looking people in the room, but it's also different thinking styles and so on and so forth. Really great management of collaboration values that diversity, because that diversity is going to allow you to see a problem from multiple angles and consider different solutions that may be a little more creative, because you have a diverse individual in the room who have the other set of experiences that the others do not. So managing diversity and leveraging that is a good management technique for collaboration. And the third one, and maybe a little more controversial, is the leveraging of bias. Now, we often think of the word bias in a somewhat negative way. It's like the inverse of prejudice, and it's like necessarily a bad thing. But I want to acknowledge the following. All of us have biases, and so we bring it to the party. And as a manager, if I'm going to manage collaboration, I'm going to have to learn to leverage the bias in the room. Now, what does that mean? It means that I need to get people to clarify as we're solving problems and looking at issues and creating solutions. I need to get individuals to basically say, well, I'm assuming this to be true, or I believe that to be true. Because when they do that, they are acknowledging their biases. But if I have 7 or 8 people in a room on my team, and they're all acknowledging their biases and they're all acknowledging their belief systems, we can begin to challenge them, or at least understand them and incorporate them into the solution set. So Steve might say, I might say, I assume this to be true, but someone else in the room might have knowledge or a set of diverse experiences to suggest my assumption is not a good assumption. And if open-minded about it, I can actually maybe change my point of view. Now, assumptions, in my opinion, are kind of things I believe to be true, but I'm ready to let them change with new information. Whereas a belief system, I'm a little more hardwired to, and even in the face of new data and experience, I might not change. This is why there is a relationship between leveraging biases and leveraging knowledge. It can be kind of an insidious problem. I will call it confirmation bias. And that is, if I'm biased towards certain things, if I believe certain things to be true, and I hold those beliefs very dearly, then I start looking for knowledge sets or data that agree with me. And I bring that to the party and say, well, here's my proof. But you really haven't done I'll call it a scientific analysis of the problem. You simply supported your own belief systems. Knowing this kind of stuff, understanding the idea of knowledge and data, experience and diversity, biases and assumptions and beliefs, if you know how to manage to those three things effectively, you can create a collaborative environment that creates better solutions, better understandings of problems, and better execution on those solutions itself. This would be a skill set for team leaders. So I would call this skill set number one, that's uniquely tied to teams, not wired up to individual management in and of itself. John, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to talk next about managing the work and the talent fit. So this is a little bit art form as much as it is sort of science. So in some cases, in some businesses, what you have is you have work processes that are so well refined and so well laid out for a variety of reasons that what you're really doing is hiring talent to fit into those work processes. And so you, for example, might have an organization that is deeply regulated, and therefore there are a set of protocols and procedures that have to be followed to meet the regulatory environment. Well, you're not hiring talent to kind of freewheel it there. What you're doing is hiring talent that can fit and use that process exactly as it's laid out. Now, an organization that might have a strategic goal of operational effectiveness, and that means managing costs to a very tight point and so on, often have very well refined processes. So they hire people to fit into the process. Now, there is the reverse can also be true, which is there are some organizations and some kind of work that has sort of a loosey-goosey nature to it. And what you really want to do is you want to look at your talent base and go, can I alter the process to fit the talent that I have in front of me? So if you think about a basketball team, they often will shift around how they play based on the talent on the floor. Or maybe another example, an orchestra may find that they have just acquired like the best violinist in the world. Well, if that's the case, then my guess would be that that orchestra will start picking pieces of music that highlight the violin a lot because they're going to highlight that talent a lot. So you got these two sort of approaches, right? One is fit the talent to the work, and the other is fit the work, work to the talent. And I think this is a bit of an art form. So there's some rules of thumb you might want to follow. It sounds something like this. If your business is more about operational effectiveness and leans heavily into process, you're probably hiring talent to fit the work. But if your work and strategic goals are a little bit more like customer intimacy, where every customer has to be addressed differently, then you might have to adjust the process to the talent you have because your talent may approach different customers differently to meet that unique, intimate moment. So I think a manager who thinks in these terms and begins to understand the nature of their work and how the nature of the talent they have and how they merge them together, this is a uniquely team leader moment and a team leader exercise. John, let's move to the next slide. Culture. So I define culture, by the way, overtly as the behavioral norms that we see on a regular basis in the workplace. So there's a lot of definitions of culture out there, but for our purposes today, I'm going to make it kind of simple. It's the behaviors. So if we say, for example, we're a trusting culture, that's great, but what are the behaviors that tell you that in fact you are a trusting culture? And I think there are here two different kinds of behavior sets. So you'll see in the icons here on the far left, one called foundational team norms. So there are research tells us there are foundational team behaviors that are almost universally true for any team that we would admire, like the jazz group that I talked about earlier, or really any other team. And those foundational team styles, we might give the phrase constructive styles to. So in my book, Alignment, Process, and Relationships, the book about teams, I highlight a tool put together by an organization called Human Synergistics, and the tool is called Group Styles Inventory. And what it does is it measures different kinds of behavioral norms. What their research tells them is that there are 4 behavioral norms that are consistently true about good high-performing teams. So if you can infuse these particular behavioral norms into your organization, into your team, you are probably a leg up in terms of moving towards a more productive team. By the way, those 4 human synergistics calls: achievement, self-actualization, humanistic encouraging, and affiliative. But take those words aside, it's actually, I'll make it more simple. They basically say 4 things. If you know how to set stretch goals for your team and reach them on a regular basis, if you and your team are energized by the work, if you and your team seem to be able to develop and grow one another, and if you and your team have solid social norms and frameworks that allow you to get along well as a team, those 4 things in and of themselves are constructive and almost always yield a more positive impact. So managing team culture is partly about managing to those 4 things. Now, there are some things that human synergistics calls defensive behavioral norms. And let me just use an example of one of those. There's 8 of them they define. I'll just describe one of them. One of them they call competitive. And here's what they mean by that. If you come to your team thinking everything is a zero-sum game and everything is about winning and losing, then as a team leader, if I have that point of view and everybody else on the team has that point of view, then what you've got is you've got kind of a destructive moment or a defensive moment here. Because in order, if you have that point of view, then in order on that team to get ahead, you need other people on that team to lose. So now you've created this win-lose dynamic, and that's not a good positive culture. So foundational team norms, the more we know about these constructive and defensive structure styles, the more we can lean into the constructive ones and lean away from the defensive ones. Also put psychological safety there. And I'm going to make this kind of simple. This is a big topic, but I'm going to try to simplify it in one simple idea. Have I created an environment in which it's safe to say what needs to be said? Or have I created an environment in which it's easier just to be silent, even though that silence sub-optimizes productivity? And I think everybody listening knows the routine, because all of us probably at one point in our career has failed to say something we know we should have said. In that moment, it was psychologically unsafe to do it, apparently. And so the degree to which a manager can create psychological safety in their team so that team members are free to say what needs to be said and contribute what needs to be contributed to, well, you're probably going to have a more effective foundational team norm. Now, those are, everything I'm talking about here are foundational, meaning it's true of virtually any team. There are also what I'm going to call strategic team behavioral norms. And by this, I mean, sometimes team behaviors are wired up more directly to the nature of strategic objectives of that team or the operational objectives of that team. So let me use a couple of examples. If any one of us wandered into a Toyota dealership and we're considering buying a Toyota and we're talking to a Toyota salesperson, I almost guarantee you that they are going to start pitching you the following way. They're going to talk about the reliability of the car. They're going to talk about the durability of the car. They're going to talk about the resale value of the car. And the reason they're doing that is because the strategic goal of Toyota is focused on quality. So the strategic behavior is to speak to that issue at hand. By the way, if I leave the Toyota dealership and wander over to an Apple store, well, they're probably going to start talking to me about the newest, coolest new thing. Well, that's because the strategic goal of Apple is about innovation, and so their behavior is associated with that goal, which is innovation. Oh, and by the way, if I leave the Apple store and have lunch at McDonald's, I'm going to be greeted by someone who's going to try to take my order quickly and get it back to me quickly and get me out the door quickly or through the drive-through quickly, because their strategic goal At McDonald's, it's about convenience, speed, and so on. So I think that there are some team behaviors that are more closely aligned with the strategic goals of the organization. Then they're not really foundational, they're more unique to an organization. And then finally, operational objectives. What I mean by that are something just day-to-day operational things. So for example, if I have operational goals around safety in the workplace, and then every time we put on those safety glasses, that is a operational behavioral norm. Or another example might be, if I believe in a sales force that we need to update daily, if our operational goal is to update daily what's been happening on the sales force out on the field, then the behavioral norm would be to go in and fill in the information in your CRM on a daily basis, which, by the way, I've never met a salesperson who likes doing that. But if that was the strategic objective, that would be the behavior. Team management of culture, I believe, has to do with understanding both foundational team goals and strategic team goals, strategic and operational, and being able to name them clearly enough for your team, discuss them with your team, and share them with your team in a way that the team walks away on a regular basis going, I know what the cultural norms are for this team. I know the behavioral goals. And then, John, finally, the last one, managing team dynamics. So I'm going to talk first pre-COVID and then like COVID. So I would describe managing team dynamics as like, how's the group do when the group is together, right? And it's kind of a lost art in some ways, and it might be getting even more lost with our current situation, because basically it's the ability to read group dynamics and then the ability to encourage healthy group dynamics. And let's face it, it's a little tougher to read group dynamics when we're all in Zoom. I want to comment about that in a second, but let me first just comment about some basic rules of thumb here. We're going to use an example that we all probably have dealt with as managers, and that would be introverts versus extroverts. So I work in a situation, I have a team of 8 people. I got 3 extroverts and I got 5 introverts, and we've all seen the dynamic. The extroverts are talking all the time and the introverts are not saying much, and you're worried that you are not getting the best out of those introverts because the extroverts are basically taking over. Well, there are ways that managers can help manage that dynamic. A simple way, for example, is introverts like to think about things before they talk. So agendas ahead of time and readings ahead of time help them get prepared. That would be a simple example of managing a group dynamic. Let's take a different one, maybe not so well discussed, contrarian behavior. There are some people in our lives who are sort of contrarians. No matter what you say, they want to tell you something else, something that was either wrong or something additional, but they have something almost contrarian to say. And if you have 8 people on your team and 3 of them have that kind of contrarian behavior in them, or mindset, then you know what happens is someone says something and pop, the next thing comes out is, well, that's not really quite true. Or someone says something that's pop, well, that's not my experience. And that dynamic over and over and over again creates a psychologically unsafe environment. Some people just go, I'm not bringing it up anymore because I'm tired of hearing the contrarian point of view. So you need to be able to manage that dynamic, which is why this is on the list. Now, in this world, pandemic, COVID, we are no longer always together, or rarely together anymore. So the ability to read the room is very difficult. In fact, here's an example. We're on a webinar and I really can't see any of you. If we were in a big auditorium, at least I'd be able to read your body language and maybe respond or adjust to what I was saying to that dynamic. So I think this is the big challenge as we move forward, is learning how to manage group dynamics to the degree we can from a virtual space. So I can share with you at least a little information that I have from a research perspective, not sort of like what I think, but more like what I know from the research side, that suggests at least some help here. And that is, there's this great article by MIT that came out a few years ago before pandemic that talked about virtual workplaces and who really manages virtual teams really well, and what are they doing to manage them well. And their conclusion was that the teams that are best managed virtually are the teams that actually do the following quite well. They are very good at task-oriented process. And let me define 3 examples of task-oriented process. I'm talking about a virtual team. Number one, virtual teams do much better when goals are crystal clear for every individual on the team and the team as a whole. So you got to up your game on the goal setting piece. Number two, work processes have to be more well understood. When we're all on the same floor together, we can kind of get by with loosey-goosey work processes because we can just turn to each other and pick up the slack somewhere. That is not true in a virtual setting. So work processes have to be more well defined. And the third one are decision rights. So we can sit around a table together as a group and maybe the decision rights, who gets to make the decision on this topic or that topic, might be unclear, but it can be resolved pretty quickly when we're all together. It can't be resolved quickly when we're all apart. And therefore the decision rights have to be clarified early on. So John gets the decision right for that topic, and virtually we all understand that if we want to do something, we need to call John and talk to him, as opposed to just like looking over at John over the shoulder going, what do you think? So it's a much more direct kind of exercise here. Task processes and being good at them seems to elevate the game from virtual. So my book, Alignment, Process, and Relationships, was written before the pandemic. If I was to write a new chapter in it, I think I'd be writing a little bit about alignment, process, relationships. That process piece has been elevated in terms of its importance and impact in a virtual setting. So, John, we'll go to the last slide. So what we have here is great teams and great results. As I mentioned to you, that group of musicians, along with 2 others, produced the best highest grossing album ever in the jazz category. So they did pretty well for themselves. But as we kind of unpack how they did it, and I read the biography of Miles Davis, and he talks about it, he had to find a way to manage the individual expertise and talent while simultaneously bringing them together as a team. And when he read the biography, I kind of caught all these things that we talked about here, from collaboration to group dynamics, fitting individuals into the work process, where letting the individuals be the work process, and then the culture of that group for the time that they were together. He was managing that culture. In fact, he called it managing the environment. So some of these things, actually many of them I talk about in my book, Alignment, Process, and Relationships, but there are plenty of great books out there on teams. Either I'll call them older ones, they're seminal ones like Five Dysfunctions of Teams or The Wisdom of Teams, which are great books to read, or more new books. There's a wonderful book that came out recently by a guy named Chris Rosell called One Mission, and it's really about how teams in the military operate together in Afghanistan and Iraq and places in the Middle East. And I read the book with a lot of admiration for his understanding of group team dynamics. In fact, he wrote another book just called Team of Teams, which I have not read yet, but I'm told it's quite good. So plenty of good books out there to read as well. So with that, maybe we've been fielding some questions in the chat box or some other questions along the way. So John, you want to kind of take over and guide people to where you want to guide them?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So if you have questions for Steve, please go ahead and drop those in the questions box. And we've had a couple that have come in throughout, which I will read now, but it's not too late to get a question in if you want to drop that in the question box. So Steve, the first question we had come through was asking if you could describe or discuss what you see as a high-performing team and what you think a high-performing team is.
Well, you hear that phrase a lot, right? And it's sort of one of those, I kind of know it when I see it, but here are some dynamics I think that I would attribute to a high performing team. Number one, exceptional results consistently delivered. So I've been on teams that can hit really exceptional goals for a short while, and then they seem to recede. And so I'm not so certain I'd call them a high performing team because we weren't consistent in our delivery of those exceptional results. So one definition I might say is consistent delivery of exceptional results. Another one would be, I think, high performing teams might be, by some definition, teams that are willing to innovate and try new things along the way. And so some teams may not last for a long time, but because they innovated, their impact beyond their life of themselves as a team is huge. And so sometimes, even though they almost look like a failure sometimes, their innovations had such positive impact over the long haul that I would judge them to be the case. Whether it's a highly innovative team or a team doing something in an innovative way, or one that gets consistently high, exceptional results, there's some energy associated with that as well. So back to the foundational cultural styles, there's something about the energy in the room with that team that kind of makes it high performing as well. They want to be together. They want to work together, and they're getting excitement from doing it. Psychologists have a name for it. They call it flow. It's like when you're so busy doing something, you don't even notice how much time's passed. Great teams have that feeling about them.
All right, thank you, Steve. And what does the phrase forming, storming, norming, and performing mean in the context of teams?
Well, that term, that phrase has been around for, or terminology has been around for a long time. In fact, I would say 50% of all teams courses, usually sooner or later, are going to come in and talk about, well, how do you go through this process of forming, storming, norming, and performing? It's simply a definition of how a team matures. So it's really a discussion of how a new team comes together. So when a new team comes together, it starts to form, and then it storms, which means they sort of work out the details of how they're going to operate as a team. And then when they norm, they're basically beginning to go, oh, this is the way we're going to actually operate. When they perform, it's like they're actually getting it right and they're performing on a regular basis. If a manager has a brand new team, I'm not talking about when someone just shows up and they inherit a team. That's not a new team. That's you're the new person on the old team. But you got a brand new team. I think you can follow this sort of thematic of we're forming for a while, we're storming for a while, we're norming for a while, and we're performing. And of course, ideally, you want to move through them relatively quickly and get to the performing. So it's a maturation model, and I like it for someone who's forming literally a brand new team. I'm not so certain it applies this directly to a team that already exists.
All right, thank you. And Steve, going back to culture, can you talk about the fragility of culture and talk about how changes in a business or a change of leadership can impact a good team's culture?
Yeah, fragility. Yeah, I mean, I guess if the simple question is team culture a fragile thing? I think the answer is most of the time it's yes. And I wish it was no, but I think most of the time it's yes. And so here's what I mean by that. I think that you have a set of cultural norms, and let's say you have a team that's a relatively high performing team. The cultural norms are excellent. People are kind of doing their thing. Uh, Things are working out really well, and the behaviors we see are all relatively positive. If a new leader shows up and suddenly starts behaving in negative ways or ways inconsistent with that culture, I believe that those leaders have such influence over the culture's dynamics that I think pretty quickly a culture could deteriorate with a lousy manager or a lousy team leader in play. There is an exception to that. So here's the exception. I'm going to call it the institutionalizing of your behaviors. So let's say you have an organizational behavior, a set of behaviors that are really positive, and it's become so institutionalized, it's like rooted, and everybody behaves this way in a very consistent fashion. A new leader comes in and counterculturally behaves differently. In an institutionalized culture, that leader will simply run into a brick wall because what they're going to find is the culture is going to reject them. So my experience is that most cultures are not institutionalized, and therefore the showing up of a lousy new leader or the impact of a terrible moment in the business creates a fragile moment for the culture. But if you got an institutionalized culture, I mean one that's really rooted in solid behaviors, and here's a good example of what institutionalized means. If I behave in a way inconsistent with the culture, someone's going to pull me aside and tell me we don't do that here. So here's an example. If I show up in a team and we're all there together in the team meeting and we all agree to do something, I walk out in the hallway afterwards and turn to somebody and go, I'm not going to do that. If it's a highly institutionalized behavior that we do what we say we're going to do, someone's going to challenge me and say, no, no, Steve, that's not how it works here. You committed to doing that in that room, so you need to do it. If someone takes me to task on that, it's been institutionalized. By the way, it cuts both ways, meaning you have a lousy culture that's fragile too. I mean, it cuts both ways.
Thank you, Steve. So sticking on culture then for a moment, and as a follow-up, how do you redirect a team that has an overly competitive culture?
Well, it's interesting because this at least the way it's been defined by human synergistics. So I'm going to keep that term because we all have a tendency to define the competitive our own way. But their definition is it's a behavioral norm that's rooted in a view that everything's a zero-sum game, winners and losers, winners and losers. So if I'm a new manager and I show up and my team has that sort of dynamic on it, I need to get them to understand that in order for person A to get ahead, person B doesn't need to lag behind. They need to get ahead simultaneously. I got to migrate them to win-win, which means I need to start setting up work processes and I need to start setting up goals that actually push towards I can't get my goal achieved unless I get so and so to work with me to get my goal achieved. So you got to migrate over goals and processes that require cooperation and coordination rather than independent behavior, because the independent behavior allows them to kind of continue to do their own thing at the expense of somebody else. So if I were in that spot, I have been a few times, I start thinking about how can I create work processes and goal sets that almost require a kind of collaboration win-win environment in order to get ahead. And then of course it takes time, right? You've got to sort of reward that behavior and you got to accept the fact and get feedback that accept the fact that they're going to stumble a few times before they get over to that space.
All right, thank you, Steve. Do you have any words of advice for aligning team goals to organizational and enterprise level goals?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'd be flippant and say you could do it, but I think managers, a lot of what we're talking about here, I believe, is for mid managers or frontline managers. This is really where we sort of aimed our conversation today. And if I'm sitting in the middle of the organization or at the front lines of an organization, of course, I need to be able to look up in the organization saying, if that's our goal, then these are the things we need to be doing here. So like my Toyota example, I know the big goal is quality, so I need to be able to replicate that in my dealership here. So I want to do that. So I think that where people often struggle is there's a lack of clarity above them about what their strategic goals are, or there is confusion or dissonance between the goals. So I'm going to talk about the dissonance part first. I've been in some organizations in which they almost seem to have contradictory goals. They say, we're all about quality, we're all about quality, and we're all about quality. Oh, by the way, we got to keep our costs way down. And you can do that for a little bit, but after a while, these two goals bump into each other, and I think that can create a lot of confusion for people. I think at that point, the managers at the front line need to become almost like advocates for their own people and turn upwards and say, you're confusing us. I think you're confusing us. Now, that requires some psychological safety, and maybe if you don't have it, it's a little harder. But I think that without the ability to ask the question about the confusion you may have or the lack of clarity you have, it's hard for that alignment to take place. You want that alignment to be in place, though, absolutely. So think of yourself as an advocate. When it isn't clear, you need to go search for it. And by the way, if you never get clarity, then just take a stake in the ground and say, this is what I'm going to assume the goal is, and here's how I'm going to align around it. But telegraph it and be transparent to everybody, saying that's what I'm doing until I hear otherwise. I'm going to focus here and do this, and then, like I say, be very very transparent about what you're doing.
All right, Steve, you mentioned psychological safety in that response. So as a leader, what are some of the best ways that you can ensure psychological safety for your team while still obtaining the needed honest feedback and input from the team along the way?
Well, the number one issue is you got to role model it as the leader yourself. So you have to be asking for the tough information to come your way, and you got to be taking it in without any issues at all in a productive fashion. So I think it starts entirely with the manager themselves, and that is they need to be able to role model what it's like to hear bad news and not overreact, but be thoughtful about it, thank people for it, thank people for difficult feedback, and so on. Once you start role modeling those behaviors, you can begin to work through the team. And by the way, some are going to be earlier adopters to this safety behavior, and some are going to be later adopters because let's face it, some people bring more baggage to the party than others. But you got to give them some time here. But you got to role model from the top. And you got probably even put yourself in situations where you're hearing bad news or taking in difficult, and you're managing that in an effective way in front of everybody. I think it's a cascade effect. Starts with you, a few more people on your team, and so on until you get to the place where people realize they can say what needs to be said. By the way, I don't mean by say what needs to be said in the following way. I've heard people use the phrase, well, we are brutally honest with each other. Like I've heard radical candor is sort of a phrase that was used about 2 or 3 years ago. You know, I've met people when they use the phrase brutally honest that they seem to enjoy the brutality more than the honesty. That's not what I mean at all. That's not good psychological safety. You want honesty, not the brutality part of it.
All right, Stephen, is it possible to set effective goals that don't have specific measurements tied to them?
Oh, sure. You know, I mean, let's face it, we live in a world where, you know, not everything has a metric tied. So if you can find a metric, I think that's great. But I'm going to distinguish in two kinds of goals here that teams often have. There's the team goal that is a business goal that probably has a metric tied to it. So if I'm a head of a recruiting team, we might have a goal that sounds something like this. Our average time to fill is 30 days. All right, so now we know what the metric is for that. That's doable. But there are other goals well, by the way, we could even do a satisfaction goal. So we might do a little survey at the end of every month with all of our hiring managers, and the survey is like 7 points, and highly satisfied is 7, and unhappy is 1. And let's say I'm looking for a 6.2 or better average. You know, we can metric those things. But then there are some things we can't do. I'll call it behavioral metrics. So we might have some some goals that sound something like this. We're going to treat people with compassion. Now, I don't know how to create a metric around that. I guess you could probably ask someone if they've been treated in a compassionate way, but I think that you have to sort of acknowledge that there are some parameters around what compassion looks like. Discuss what those behaviors look like. Compassionate behaviors look like X, Y, and Z, and then give each other feedback on it. But you're kind of like sightseeing as opposed to a metric. I would describe them, by the way, as principles-based as opposed to process-based work. Sometimes it's simply the principles we follow, like the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. It's hard. Don't put a metric around it, but you kind of know it.
All right, great, Stephen. I've got one more for you then. If you could name only one thing a team leader could do to create a good team, what would that be?
well, well, I guess if I had to pick only one, I think I would say I'm going to hire the right people. You know, if I can get out of the blocks with the right people, I I can probably make a lot of progress a lot faster. So I will tell you, I'm always a little stunned when people shortchange the hiring process. If they hand it all over to HR to do most of the work, and then they interview at one time and they hire somebody, I realize that sometimes time and urgency requires that. But let me tell you, we can all play like a little drinking game where let's name how many people we've hired that we regret, and now let's take a drink every time we do it. Many of us could get pretty drunk pretty fast because we made bad choices. Whereas if you take your time, not that you won't make a bad choice occasionally, but you know what? If you get the right person out of the chute for your team, that can make a big difference. So if I only had to pick one, I'd say hire them right.
All right, thank you, Steve. It's great advice, and I think a good place to wrap things up here. So want to thank you, Steve, for taking the time today to join us to share your insights. And I want to thank everyone on the line for attending today's webinar. If you're interested in continuing today's discussion, we invite you to join us for Managing Teams Effectively, which is an 8-week online program that will equip you with the knowledge and the tools necessary to accurately diagnose problems, manage group dynamics, coach team and individual behaviors to improve performance, and understand how to communicate effectively, empathize with others, overcome challenges, and diffuse team conflict. You can find out more about managing teams effectively by visiting go.wisc.edu/cped teams online or checking out our website at uwcped.org. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you're able to implement some of these techniques on your next project. Steve, any final words you want to say before we part?
No, just that good luck with all the teamwork that I know you have to deal with out there. It's manageable, so good luck with it.
Stay safe, everybody. Stay well, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.